All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today on this channel, we're going to talk about a case that we've never really mentioned before, and that is, of course, the case of Casey Anthony, or more specifically, what really happened with the death of her daughter, Kaylee Marie Anthony, back in 2008. On December 11th, 2008, the remains of Kaylee Anthony were found buried in a shallow grave in Florida, and then it just turned into a giant question mark about who was responsible for her death. Was it her mother, Casey? Was it her grandfather? Was it some sort of fictitious nanny named Zanny of all things? But this is one of the things the nation by storm, and we covered the O.J. Simpson case a lot on this channel, like discussing some alternative theories associated with O.J. Simpson, some what ifs, if you will. But when it comes to Casey Anthony, it's a little bit different because this was one where I could tune in to the news every now and then, and of course, like YouTube was really switching over from just only user generated content to a lot of people kind of just, making their own as YouTubers and discussing, well, cases like Casey Anthony. And of course, I even watched some reaction vids, but a big difference is not only social media, but it's like I also had the ability to watch this stuff in live time. Whereas, I was alive during the O.J. Simpson trial, but I was a kid at the time. I didn't really comprehend what was going on. And furthermore, it's like I was only kind of just listening to the name O.J. Simpson would come into the news headlines once in a while. I had no idea what was really happening. And it wasn't until I was a teenager that I even knew that O.J. Simpson was a football player. Because, as a kid, it wasn't that something that, of that major importance to me. I never really looked into him the way I kind of look into cases now. But when we want to look at somebody like Casey Anthony, who is not really a star celebrity. She was not someone who was a star football player running for 2,000 yards in a season, who did Naked Gun movies, who was the spokesperson for Hertz rental cars. None of that. And you're going to have to forgive my language, but I'm not the biggest Casey Anthony fan like anybody is. She was a loser. She was someone who couldn't hold down a job. She was an ordinary girl from Florida. And to this day, Casey Anthony never declared to the public who the father of Kaylee Anthony is. And some people interpret that as meaning that she just flat out does not know because, well, that's kind of a Maury show thing that they could try and solve for her, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, nor would they. I mean, like, I'm not even touching that with a 10-foot pole. Okay, now, what really happened with the Casey Anthony trial? And moreover, if we're going to discuss theories on this channel, because on this channel we really like to discuss kind of the theories, the hypotheticals, and kind of just try to gain a larger understanding. Did she murder her daughter? And that's kind of what we're going to go through today. I was watching the Dateline, well, it said it was a Dateline upload, Dateline 48 Hours, one of those uploads online. You can see it here on YouTube. And they kind of showed some things that I kind of cleared up some misconceptions that I had about the case. Once again, we mentioned that Kaylee Anthony was found December 11th, 2008, right? And at this point, her body had been so decomposed that there were only skeletal remains. So that made it very difficult for them to determine the cause of death. She had been wrapped in two trash bags, and there had been duct tape found at the scene. When I was reading about this stuff back, it was like it was my understanding that the duct tape had actually been found over the mouth, like on the jaw. Once again, dealing with skeletal remains. And one of these websites even said that there was a heart-shaped sticker on the duct tape. I was reading through some stuff earlier today, and I didn't see any other sources confirming the heart-shaped sticker. But that was one of the things that just kind of blew my mind. Remember, that's my initial kind of presupposition, if I'm using the word correctly. And I was just like, how on earth could a jury find her not guilty of murder? Like if there had been duct tape over the mouth and then a heart shaped sticker. But then they concocted this whole thing that Kaylee had drowned in the pool and then they had buried the body. And I was like, you don't. What, you thought someone had drowned in the pool, so you put duct tape over her mouth? I mean, like, that is the most ridiculous to me. But I mean, that's a very, very widely spread thing on the internet that there was duct tape found over her mouth on the jaw. But when I was looking at the crime scene photos during this 48 hours special, they were sort of showing something where it looks like the duct tape was actually to the side of the body, if I recall correctly. So otherwise, that's kind of not the most definitive statement that this would be the this would have been something that would have been used to silence her. Also, the defense would have kind of gone at it. No DNA found on the duct tape that was tied to Kaylee, but at that point in decomposition, I think I agree with the assessment that, okay, well, I mean, it had been so long, dealing with the weathering of the elements at that point. I mean, that's not a shocker that they wouldn't have found duct tape on. They wouldn't have found DNA on the duct tape if it had been, you know, if it had been dealing with the rain and like all sorts of weathering elements that would have affected that situation. We also know, of course, that Casey Anthony did not report her daughter missing for 31 days. And then it's like, some people think that that's instantaneous guilt. Back in 2011, I used to work in a restaurant, and I was like walking by, doing my work and stuff, and we had this table of customers, and they were just talking about the Casey Anthony trial, and then someone was just like, "A mother does not do that," and the woman sitting next to her, they're friends at a table. The woman sitting next to her says, "That's not evidence," and she's like, "Who parties for a month while her daughter is missing?" And the woman says again, "That's not evidence." And it's like, it's bizarre, it's weird, but I guess I kind of have to agree with the assessment that even though that is horrendously bizarre behavior, abnormal, ridiculous, selfish, ignorant, but that does not necessarily mean with 100% that she murdered her daughter. And one of the most either ironic or disgusting things with this case, depending on how you look at it, is Casey Anthony got a tattoo on her back that says Bella Vita, which I guess means beautiful life. Craziness. And that was during, the 31 days of partying. A lot of people make the kind of interpretation of all of this, everything that we've laid out. Kaylee Anthony is found dead. Casey Anthony's out partying for 31 days. Well, that Casey Anthony simply either wanted to go back to single life, she had a relationship with a club promoter, and she felt that just that Kaylee Anthony was dragging down her life. She had a kid that she did not want to take care of, so she's trying to do the most horrendous thing possible to get back to single life. I mean, I don't know if that's the most plausible thing in the world. I mean, when you sort of lay it out like that, it just sounds horrendously disgusting, but we have to look at the events that actually have played out. And that's not just me. I didn't come up with that statement. That's kind of the majority of Americans believe that she killed her daughter because she didn't want the responsibilities of motherhood and she wanted to continue being single, or she wanted to continue kind of this somewhat of a relationship she had with this club promoter, as well as trying to go out clubbing and so on, and all of these things that were hindered by motherhood. Is that the real motivation? Well, maybe, but I think there's some other things that we need to discuss. When we kind of examine the situation, we can see that there were numerous searches on Casey Anthony's computer for various things from chloroform, neck breaking, homemade weapons, and my favorite one was shovel. And this was probably something that the defense would just be like, I'm sure Jose Baez was probably just laughing when he heard this stuff. I mean, okay, someone did a Google search for a shovel. That is not really that big of a deal. The sort of neck breaking thing, well, Kaylee Anthony's neck was not broken. We do know that much. Because if they're able to recover the skeletal remains, I'm almost certain they'd be able to determine that her neck was not broken. And there's kind of a big theory that we're going to talk about how Kaylee actually died in a second. So stay with us here. The thing with chloroform is something that's very peculiar, right? And there's even one girl on YouTube. I was just going through YouTube clips, and a couple years after the trial, it must have been 2014 or something, maybe 13, somebody was like, she was claiming to be Casey Anthony's cellmate in prison. And like, she's kind of being a ditzy girl. I don't know if it's an act or not, but she's just like, oh yeah, like, yeah, Casey told me she had that thing like chlorophyll, chloroform, something like that. And she gave it to her daughter so she could fall asleep. And some people were kind of interpreting that as Kaylee Anthony was using, Casey Anthony was using chloroform to knock Kaylee out, and that one day she just didn't wake up, and that left them with the situation where they were, because she just didn't want to get a babysitter. It was the easiest thing for her to do was knock her out with chloroform. That was kind of my initial theory about this. I mean, I was a casual observer of the trial, even though I mentioned that I lived through it, right? But I wasn't someone who was watching the stuff every single day, every single night, and taking notes and stuff. As a casual observer, my initial kind of theory on this was that she was using chloroform to knock her daughter out, and that one day Kaylee just didn't wake up. But a big thing to say about the chloroform is yesterday we were talking about the concept of the appeals process with a trial. Like, for example, we mentioned with O.J. Simpson that, if there had been any evidence tampering that had been brought to light, he could have won the appeal, right? The reason why I brought that up is I heard it from, someone talking about the Casey Anthony trial, and they said that they represented this. The prosecution represented the chloroform issue in an incorrect way to the jury. In fact, there was only one single search for chloroform on Casey Anthony's computer, but the prosecution told the jury that there had been multiple ones. If I recall correctly, they said something like 80 searches were done for chloroform, but that was incorrect. There was only one single one. But I have to confess to you, the source that I'm citing for that is Geraldo Rivera, and I'm even embarrassed to mention his name, that I'm citing Geraldo Rivera as a source. I mean, I don't necessarily know if his assessment is correct, but what he was saying was if Casey Anthony had been found guilty, she would have won the appeal as well, because it's the same thing we mentioned with OJ. It's like, no matter how much you dislike the person, they have the right to a fair trial. And if the prosecution is saying incorrect information to the jury, they didn't get a fair trial, so that they can use that in the appeals process, and they will most likely win the appeal. So, I mean, that's something that we can always kind of examine. Even if Casey Anthony had been found guilty of this crime, she might have won the appeals process. Geraldo Rivera was also kind of someone who was promoting the sexual abuse angle of Casey Anthony, where that was kind of one of the big things with her defense, where they were trying to say that she's a victim of sexual abuse, and that kind of to the point where it's almost like, okay, Kaylee Anthony goes missing, and then because of the abuse that Casey had suffered in her life, she just kind of lost control. She had some sort of mental break, and she lost it, in other words, if I remember and understand what they were trying to say. But I don't want to comment on that too much, because I think that that is kind of a distraction. And that's exactly how the defense wanted to play this. Since I've been listening to things about these high profile court cases, you confuse. And perhaps Jose Baez and what was the other guy's name? Cheney Mason, her other defense lawyer. They were probably just trying to confuse the jury with all of these things about, oh, maybe she had this mental break. Oh, maybe something else happened to Kaylee Anthony. Well, I think that this is just a disgusting situation, and it's very, very, very likely that none of that is true, and that Casey Anthony murdered her daughter. But what really happened to Kaylee? Well, there's always the concept of Zanny the Nanny, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. That was apparently a fictitious name that Casey Anthony somehow pulled out of a hat. She was telling all her family that Kaylee Anthony was missing because she had been staying with their nanny named Zanny. Convenient, right? And then they're like, what does Zanny mean? Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez was her name. And it turned out that Kaylee was just making up a story. She didn't know anybody named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. But there actually was a real person in Florida named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, or somewhere in America. And she filed a lawsuit against Casey Anthony saying that you were using my name in this way, like you've damaged my reputation. She tried to sue her for damages. And I think the judge threw that out being a frivolous lawsuit or something. And in all fairness, that woman wouldn't have really received an enormous amount of damage if she hadn't come forward and put herself in the public eye, making it worse. But what really is Zanny the Nanny? I would say one thing. I retract the theory from the past, where I was saying that she was using chloroform to knock out her daughter. No, I retract that. That was something I thought about maybe 6 years ago when I wasn't that informed on the case. And I'm not an expert on Casey Anthony like some people were, as I mentioned, watching every night, taking notes. But a lot of people have been dropping a comment from time to time that I've been reading through these things. And it's the commenters. I don't think I've ever heard this from a person on television or one of these even YouTubers. I was just reading lots of comments where people are saying Zanny the Nanny was a code name for Xanax, that Casey Anthony had been giving her daughter Xanax as a way to knock her out. So once again, she could go out with her boyfriend, or she could go to the bars and clubs, or just so a reason she didn't have to deal with babies, with finding a baby, or let alone paying for it. Who knows how she would have got the Xanax? Maybe her boyfriend bought it for her. But yeah, that's what they're saying. Zanny the Nanny. The reason why Kaylee Anthony used that particular name is because it was a code name for Xanax, and that she had been drugging her kid. She had been drugging Kaylee Anthony. And it's a very similar thing to that chloroform theory that I mentioned. Kaylee was given Xanax, and one morning she just didn't wake up. And then that's when Casey Anthony, very similar names, excuse me for jumbling them a little. That's when Casey Anthony kind of panics, and then she puts Kaylee's body in the trunk of her car, and they believe that Kaylee's body was in the trunk of her car for a multitude of days, 3 days or 4 days rather, and then she buried her in the shallow grave, once again, wrapped in 2 trash bags. I'm not necessarily sure the role of the duct tape, because the duct tape might have in fact just been to secure the trash bags. Like, once again, it was always my understanding that the duct tape was covering the jaw area, but I think that they're really trying to show that that's kind of a misconception that was presented to the press, or through the press rather, like that this is something that had just been kind of presented as, a falsehood, really. We're not really sure. Like, in the photos that I saw, it seems like the duct tape is actually to the side of the remains site, if that is indeed the initial place where they found it. But the big thing that we would say about that is, it sounds like something that is just all too common that we kind of get in these situations where this is one of the largest theories in the Madeleine McCann mystery about what happened to Madeleine McCann, almost an identical thing. One of the large theories is that the parents were giving their kids drugs, and that Madeleine had an adverse reaction, and that led to the exact same situation. And you also have cadaver dogs examining the trunk of a car and finding a positive identification for a body. Well, what's going on there? Probably because there's a dead body that was in that car at some point. I mean, like, this is kind of just. I mean, it's almost heart wrenching when you sort of hear it laid out like that. So it's a very large theory that I think a lot of people want to explore, or that they think that it's most likely that it happened. Casey Anthony was drugging her daughter in some way, giving her some sort of drug, most likely Xanax, to knock her out so she wouldn't have the responsibilities of finding a babysitter or taking care of her or having a reason to stay home. And I believe there was even a comment that Casey had made to some friends about how she wanted to go out, but she had to stay with the little snot nose. Put that in quotation marks, because that's like the big thing. I forget the exact wording, but there's that famous line about the little snot nose complaining that she had to stay at home with Kaylee. And it's a very difficult thing to do, but I mean, it's a very difficult thing to imagine It's difficult for us to fathom, the viciousness of somebody who's going to either drug her daughter to death or murder her so she can have a social life. I mean, talk about despicable. But when you want to look at how this all played out for the jury, a lot of people were thinking kind of one of my initial suspicions, where it's like, a lot of people think the trash was put there. She just kept a bag of trash in the car to provide an explanation about why her trunk smelled so bad. I mean, you keep a dead body in your trunk for 4 days. Mother's like, it smells like there was a dead body in the damn car. And then people confront her about that so much, and you can hear her shouting them down. Oh, there was a rotting pizza in the trunk of that car. There was a bag of garbage in the trunk of that car. And Casey Anthony might be one of the few things that actually allowed her to walk out of jail a few days after her trial. Because it's like the car. It's not only the smell, which was probably just what she was trying to cover up. I mean, we're talking about probably just completely contaminated the crime scene. They found DNA in the trunk of the car, right? But then they're like, well, it's all that stuff. It's like things were decomposing. And once again, another thing that probably helped Casey Anthony win the trial is it had been so long since Kaylee was seen. All sorts of evidence had been decomposing. And the 31 days partying, the bag of trash in the car, Casey Anthony's own ignorant lifestyle probably helped her in this by destroying evidence. Now it's like, what do you really make of the jury, though? What do you think about the jury's? I mentioned on my channel Lionel Nation, and he's a lawyer who has a YouTube channel. And in a video on Casey Anthony, he said very clearly that the jury made the right decision. They made the right decision because if you can't determine the cause of death, you cannot determine whether or not someone was murdered, or that this was an accident, or that this was what the cause of death was. But it's very interesting that, if I recall, the duct tape, because like you're trying to say that your kid died in an accident, and then why is there duct tape around the head of the body or something? Why would you need to do something like that or what would ever possess a person to do something like that if there had been any sort of accident or natural cause death? Like, what is that all about? But then ultimately, the coroner had to rule that the cause of death could not be determined. What do you guys think? Do you agree with the jury that she should have been found not guilty? Or do you think that the suspicious circumstances around her death trump reasonable doubt? In the past, I mean, like, I was completely in favor of the latter. I was just like, I mean, not only do we have DNA in the trunk of her car, not only do we have the kind of shallow grave where she was buried, which, let's just even ask another question. As far as I recall, it's illegal to dispose of human remains in such a manner. Why wasn't she charged with the illegal disposal of a body? Why wasn't she charged with reckless endangerment for not reporting her daughter missing? Or some sort of other child endangerment thing. I mean, something on the books. I mean, like, the charges that were placed against her were honestly not enough. And furthermore, we definitely know that she was guilty of certain things. Once again, if she claims to have participated in the illegal disposal of a body, shouldn't she have been charged with that? I mean, I've heard of other cases on shows like 48 Hours where they're talking about how people get charged for that very same crime and they go to jail. I was watching this whole episode once, and it's focusing on the girl who just dealt with the disposal of remains, not the murder. Never charged with the murder. And they're interviewing her from prison, and they're saying, "Oh yeah, they think that I cut up this body and buried it. No, I didn't do it." That's what they're focusing on, but of course it wasn't that gruesome with the Kaylee Anthony scene. But at the same time, why wasn't she charged with those things? That would have definitely held up with a conviction. So we can definitely sort of see that the way that the legal system was spun kind of pulled people into this very, very, what would be the exact word? this kind of just small world where the law didn't take its course. But Alan Dershowitz was commenting on the Casey Anthony trial, and he said some very interesting things when he's just like, the justice system in America is not about guilt and it's not about innocence. It's just about how the lawyers played the arguments, right? And that's exactly what happened with Casey Anthony. That's what happened with Jose Baez, and that's what happened with Cheney Mason. They played their arguments, and this was kind of they put these things out, and the jury apparently felt that there was some sort of reasonable doubt. And I do have to kind of insist, Casey Anthony's negligence in this probably worked to her advantage because of decomposition, because of contaminating the crime scenes. It turned all of the positives into just an ambiguous area. All of the certainty that, yes, she murdered her daughter, yes, she disposed of the body, turned all of those things into just an ambiguous area. But anyway, what do you think about all these things? Do you think that Casey Anthony murdered her daughter, or do you support an alternative theory on the internet? Do you believe that she should have been charged with something else, like the improper disposal of a body or some sort of child endangerment? And do you believe that there is a sort of a flaw in the justice system, that it isn't really designed to kind of truly bring justice? Also, what do you think about the theory that Casey Anthony had been giving her daughter Xanax, that Zanny the nanny is actually indeed a code word for Xanax? And if you have anything to say at all, please drop a comment below. Maybe we'll do some more episodes on Casey Anthony, but we kind of covered the bulk of many of the theories. So please drop a comment below and let's talk some more.